Welcome everyone to our STARFest online on a Sunday afternoon. My name is Michelle Steinhusen. I'm the STARFest director and the adult programming librarian at the St. Albert Public Library. And very excited today to have our STARFest Presents Ellen Keith, hosted by Elinor Florence. As I said, I'm joining you from St. Albert Public Library, which is on Treaty 6 territory, which is the traditional lands of First Nations and Métis people. And as the library is, we acknowledge that the library is a colonial institution, and we're working hard to act on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. So part of that is having the privilege of sharing stories and hearing different voices at our library. So for this afternoon, we have invited back two STARFest favorites, because we love doing that, bringing back favorites. Ellen Keith brought us her best-selling novel, The Dutch Midwife, in 2018 at STARFest. And it's good we're doing this event online with like virtually unlimited seating, because when we had Ellen in 2018, we had to host her in the Arden Theater because we had too many people for our program room in the library. Ellen has an undergraduate degree in history with a focus on World War II and Holocaust studies from the University of Alberta, as well as an MFA in creative writing from the University of British Columbia. The anticipation for Ellen's second novel, The Dutch Orphan, was high, and I was actually lucky to get a chance to read it before this event because we have so many holds on the book in all its forms. So I did manage to sneak it in before this event. Ellen is originally from St. Albert and now lives in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. And we're so lucky for technology because Ellen is joining us from Amsterdam and Elinor is joining us from the mountains in BC. So Elinor Florence also joined us in 2018 at STARFest with her second novel, Wildwood, and she filled our program room in the library. Wildwood was named by Kobo as one of the best 100 Canadian novels of all time. And it was a very popular book club book at the library. Elinor grew up on a farm near North Battleford, Saskatchewan, which was close to a former Second World War training airfield. She worked as a journalist for 30 years, including 8 years as a regular writer for Reader's Digest. Her first novel, Bird's Eye View, was published in 2014 and is about a young Canadian woman who joins the Air Force in World War II. Her interest in the Second World War makes her a natural choice to interview Ellen. She recently completed her third manuscript, which is very exciting. It's a historical novel about women Alberta homesteaders. She's married with 3 grown daughters, and she lives in the mountain resort of Invermere, BC. So I will post links to both Ellen and Elinor's websites in the chat. They've got all sorts of neat things there. This is a virtual event, but we do want it to be an interactive event. So please post your comments and your questions in the chat. Just make sure that your chat is set to everyone. If you click on chat and then look towards the bottom, you want to make sure it's set to everyone, and Ellen and Elinor will tackle your questions at the end of the interview. So I am going to ask Ellen and Elinor to pop on, and I'm going to pop off because nobody needs to see me. All right, have a great afternoon, and I will pop back on at the end of the interview. Thank you, Elinor and Ellen. Welcome, and welcome everyone.
Thanks, Michelle. Hi, Ellen.
Hi.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well. Thanks. It's so nice to be here today.
Yeah, and I'm so pleased that so many people have joined. That's great. I'm just going to jump right in here now and start at the beginning, because I always like to start at the beginning. maybe you could just tell us a little bit about your childhood and growing up in St. Albert. Actually, maybe you could explain to our viewers where St. Albert is and a little bit about it.
Yeah, so I grew up in St. Albert. I lived there until I was 22 or 23, right when I finished my undergrad. And yeah, St. Albert is just north of Edmonton in Alberta for anyone who's joining outside of the province. And it was a wonderful community to grow up in. And I always felt so welcome and so at home in St. Albert. And it's been really wonderful to see the amount of support that's still coming in today for my writing from so many people from my hometown.
You're not nervous speaking to your hometown crowd here?
I mean, it's always a bit strange trying to have a talk on Zoom. It would be so lovely to see everyone in person, but it's really wonderful that there's so many people came on their Sunday. I was getting some emails from people that the link isn't working, so I hope that people have managed to connect, but looking forward to this.
And does your family still live in St. Albert, and do you visit?
I definitely visit. I was there in December. I still have quite a few friends and family living in St. Albert or St. Albert area, cousins, uncles. My grandmother and my brother are based in Edmonton and my parents on Vancouver Island, but I still have quite a St. Albert network for sure.
Okay. So now when I was studying up on your background, I read that one of the things that sparked your interest in the Second World War was a trip that your parents took you on when you were a kid. And I'm just wondering, were you that kid in class who had the writing talent and the teachers all said you were going to be a writer someday? Is that how it worked?
Well, I'm pretty sure some of my teachers, former teachers, are in the call today, so they would be better to attest to that. But I always loved writing. I remember doing stories in grade 3, grade 4, and those were always my favorite units in class. So I really was always drawn to it, I think, from an early age. And I think the more I went through school and started also really developing an interest in social studies and history, then I started looking at other ways that I could pull in content for my writing as well.
And the trip that your parents took you on to Europe?
Yeah, so when I was 10 and my brother was 8, my parents pulled my brother and I out of school for 6 months, and we rented one of those old camper vans that are now very trendy, back in vogue today, with a pop-up roof, and we traveled around Europe for 6 months. And I think a lot of it, I mean, we went all over Western Europe, but what stuck with me the most maybe was some of the World War I and World War II sites that we visited. We went and saw some of the trenches from World War I in northern France. We went to the D-Day anniversary ceremony on June 6th and met some Canadian veterans who were there for the ceremony. So that was those kind of things, especially meeting people at that young age who had served in the war and who were still coming back year after year insofar as was possible for them. That really left an impression for me. And when we were in the Netherlands, where I have family ties, we did things like we went to the Anne Frank house, which I had done a research project on in school already. So I had this natural interest in seeing everything in real life. And I think that was part of the reason that I ended up moving to the Netherlands in 2013.
Now, skipping ahead a little bit, you took your undergrad degree at U of A, and then you took your master's degree online through University of British Columbia. And it was your thesis, I believe, that became your first best-selling novel. I wonder if you could explain how that happened. I believe you won a prize with your thesis.
Yes, that's right. So I did my undergrad at the University of Alberta, and they have it's called the Write program, which is just a minor in creative writing. So I was mainly focusing on World War II studies in my history degree there. And I arrived at a sort of a fork in the road where I thought, I'm moving to Amsterdam. Either I do my master's in Holocaust Studies at the University of Amsterdam, or I pursue a Master's of Fine Arts in Creative Writing. And there was an online program through the University of British Columbia. In the end, I thought I decided to take a bit of a risk and see if I could pursue the writing as my primary focus. And I told myself I would give myself 5 years to try to get a book out from the time that I started working on it, or for the time I graduated, I think was my decision. And right around the time that I was graduating, actually exactly 10 years ago this year, UBC and HarperCollins partnered together and they founded a prize for current students and alumni of the program. And I just finished my manuscript and I was so on the fence on whether or not to submit to this contest, because I had just gotten some pretty harsh feedback in a writing conference where I had submitted my first page in a very public way on stage for critique. So I wasn't feeling too confident about my book, but I thought this is a chance that only comes once a year, and now only once every 2 years. So at the 11th hour, I hit upload and ended up submitting my manuscript, and lo and behold, ended up winning the prize, which for me just opened so many doorways in terms of my writing career and where I am today.
How did you receive word that you won the prize? Where were you and what was your reaction?
Yeah, so I submitted this prize and then I took off to Central America backpacking on my own for a few months. Thought I'm going to I was doing some translation work at the time and just going from hostel to hostel. And I thought I was going to try to polish up the manuscript and get it up to quality. So I was really thinking, I'm not going to have any chance here. So I need to start getting it ready to submit elsewhere. And I was in the middle of a huge tropical storm in Panama. It was hurricane warnings. We were stuck in this hostel for days on end, couldn't even go as far as the grocery store. And I had to have a call. I found out I'd been shortlisted for this prize. So I was in the hostel reception area on this landline with a terrible connection on a 3-way call with my now agent and with my future editor at HarperCollins. And I think I probably made such a dramatic scene in the middle of this hostel lobby because I was so shocked when I found out that it was actually a surprise that they were going to tell me already that I'd won the prize.
That's a great story. What a fantastic feeling that must have been. And you're a young writer. You were 28, I believe, at the time that your first novel was published in 2018. So that's a fantastic story, Ellen. I guess we should tell our readers, well, I mean, I'm pretty sure everybody's read the book, but The Dutch Wife was about a young woman from Amsterdam who volunteered to become a prostitute in a concentration camp, serving the prisoners in the camp rather than face almost certain death from starvation or disease. It's such a strong hook, I think, that it really stands out in a growing field of Second World War fiction, because it's such a little known aspect of the war. And I think I heard you explain in another interview that it's not something that would have been talked about either by the women who did it or the prisoners, perhaps, who visited the camp brothel. So it's just an amazing story, and congratulations again. It's gotten a lot of acclaim. Now, I guess we should move on though and talk about your new book, which just came out 2 months ago, The Dutch Orphan. And it's not a sequel, even though the titles are similar in a way, and the subject matter is somewhat similar, I guess. When I read the second book, I felt that you had probably used a lot of the research that you gathered the first time around, and maybe you felt that there was more story to tell about that particular time and place. Is that how you came up with the idea for the second novel?
Actually, I was several months into writing another story, which I'm returning to right now. And at one point, my editor came to me with a news article that he had found, and it was on Mona Parsons, who is a Canadian woman. You may have seen a Heritage Minute about her at some point, but she was originally from Nova Scotia and was an actress, ended up marrying a Dutch man and moving to the Netherlands to a town called Laren. And she got involved with the Dutch resistance when the war broke out, ended up being imprisoned, and had quite a dramatic escape from prison, which is very closely tied to some of the events in my book. And we were talking about this, and we thought this is really fascinating, a really interesting story. And it got us thinking about all the other things about the occupation of the Netherlands that I hadn't touched on, because so much of my first novel takes place in a concentration camp in Germany. And I thought that was something that was still really worth exploring, especially because I think that there's a really interesting divide between the way the Dutch talk about the occupation and everything that happened in literature versus the type of World War II novels that we're seeing on the North American side of the Atlantic. And I think there's quite a lot of nuance, and they're very careful in how they're presenting these war stories, because I think it's all too easy to just lean into these stories of heroism and have everything be very black and white. And what I really admire about some of these stories that I'm seeing in the Netherlands is that there's also this understanding that it was not a very clean-cut situation. There was a lot of gray area, a lot of moral ambiguity in terms of how people acted during the war, how people act in any time of crisis in general. And there was, I think, some of the numbers and things are a little blown out of proportion in terms of these stories of heroism. So I really wanted to try to write a novel where I could explore that spectrum of different reactions in the war.
And you did a great job. For those of you who haven't read the book yet, The Dutch Orphan concerns two sisters who were in Amsterdam when it was occupied by the Germans. One chose to join the resistance, and the other chose to remain married to her Nazi-loving husband, who is also Dutch, but he was a collaborator. I guess you'd call him a collaborator, would you?
Yes, yeah. So he was in the Dutch Fascist Party.
Mm-hmm. So again, you chose those two examples of, and Lisbeth, is that how you say her name? Lisbeth?
Lisbeth,
yes.
Yeah.
Yes, she was the one who was most conflicted. Her sister Jo joined the resistance with a passion and ended up adopting a Jewish baby rather than have it disappear. So she was all in, and the other sister was kind of sitting on the fence. And I just think I felt more sympathy for Lisbeth, because I felt that the choices that you had to make back then were so complex. You mentioned numbers. Yes, I've heard it said that after the war, everybody was in the resistance. Everybody claimed to have been in the resistance rather than a collaborator. But I think you said the vast majority of people did nothing. I mean, they kept their heads down and went about their business and prayed that it would soon be over. And I think that's the choice that most of us would have made, because why on earth would you want to risk your own life, and more importantly, the lives of your children and your family members, by getting caught doing resistance activities? So what about you, Ellen? Which character did you most identify with?
That's an interesting question. So first of all, I'm pleasantly surprised that you identified with Lisbeth, because for me, that was a very risky character to write. I think when we're writing stories or film or anything that's for entertainment purposes, we have on the one side what works very well dramatically. And of course, we want a hero to cheer for as a reader or as a viewer of a film. But for me, Lisbeth's character was really important to keep in. And I had a lot of conversations with my editor about her character because he pointed out, and I agree, that it's a risky character to write and a problematic one in some ways. She's not very likable in some ways. She's on the fence. She's pretty focused on her own self-preservation and focused on her marriage and her feelings for someone else that come into play as well, versus her sister Johanna, who's very altruistic. But I thought that was so important to capture because, again, I wanted to have this portrayal of, I think, what is more of the reality of the situation. And that is that less than 0.5% of the Dutch population was in the resistance, whereas we have 25,000 people, men who volunteered to join the Waffen SS, so fighting for the Germans. And we had at its peak up to 4% of the Dutch population supporting the Dutch Fascist Party, the NSB. So we, of course, as for entertainment purposes, those stories of resistance they're compelling, they're inspiring, and they do warm our hearts. But I thought if I only had Johanna's character in the novel, that wouldn't be very fair. And I do think there's very valid reasons why people would be more focused on their own inner circles and their family. There were so many daily challenges that people had to face in the occupation, whether it was, where am I going to find the fabric to make clothes for my children, or how am I going to feed them with the hunger winter approaching? So there were a lot of different challenges and everyone responded in different ways. And I was trying to bring in different characters who would capture those different reactions.
Well, you did a great job, I thought. I was fortunate enough to interview a guy myself who lived in my little town in Invermere, British Columbia, whose family hid 2 Jewish people during the war. And after the war, his parents were named righteous among the nations, which is a very significant designation, and their names appear on a wall at the Holocaust Memorial in Israel. Casey was a 20-year-old guy at the time, but he was the oldest of 6 children. The youngest, I think, was only 8. And his parents they lived in a little town called Niverdal near the German border. And his parents took in a Jewish couple and hid them in their house for 2 years. Now, in that case, I said to Casey, what possessed your parents to do such a thing when they had young children in the house and they could have all been put up against the wall and shot if they'd been caught? And he said his parents were members of the Dutch Reformed Church. And in their case, the motivation was religious. His mother said, the Jews are God's chosen people, and it is our responsibility to keep them safe. So I understood their passion. And I just wondered, what were the other motivations for resisting? Because I'm sure not everybody was motivated by religious reasons.
So at the time, Dutch society was really divided in what they call sort of a pillarization side of society. So we had people that sort of stuck within their groups, the main groups being Protestants, Catholics, Social Democrats, and then sort of a liberal branch as well. So religion was a pretty big factor for a lot of people, but I think actually around 20% of the Dutch resistance was communist. So there were political motivations coming into play that were really important. I think also really important is the idea that the Dutch resistance got started in an organized sense later than in countries like Belgium and France. Part of the reason for this is because the initial attempts at resistance, which happened with the general strike in 1941, there were drastic reprisals for that. People were executed. So that sort of scared down some of the resistance for a while. Later, we have these deportations starting of the Jewish population. And it wasn't until 1943 where we start seeing Dutch men being rounded up for forced labor in Germany. So that was one of the things that kicked off the resistance for sure, because now you don't just have the Jewish population being affected, but everyone has someone being affected. So we have that coming into play. Suddenly, a lot more people are going into hiding. Estimates are around 300,000 people were in hiding during the war, including people like my grandmother's brother was in hiding because he had been called up for labor in Germany. And he actually is the inspiration for the character of Gerrit in the novel, the brother character in the novel. So we have several 100,000 people in hiding, around 30,000 of which were Jews. Another thing that's really interesting is the Jewish population in the Netherlands had been extremely well integrated for centuries. We have them going back to the sort of Dutch Golden Age period, where they were really part of society. They, I think, visually and socially blended in a lot more. So it was really seen as these are Dutch people that are being deported. And I think that was this idea of we have to stand up for our neighbors as well, which was a really important thing. But religion, I think, was definitely one of the major factors for sure.
I think it's fair to say, is it not, that most people, well, everyone, I guess, when the Jewish people started to be deported, nobody really knew where they were going or what was happening to them. It seems incredible in this day and age that, you know, that information was so inaccessible to the vast population. Even if they heard rumors, they seem so unbelievable, even to us today, thinking about what truly happened. It's hard to swallow. So I suppose many people would have just thought, well, they are going off to work camps. They'll come back after the war is over or be resettled somewhere else. I mean, it wasn't considered a life and death thing for most people. Am I correct?
I think there was a tipping point. In the beginning, of course, the magnitude of something like the Holocaust is so unfathomable that it did take a really long time before it was clear what was going on and the magnitude of it. In the Netherlands, it was also a bit of a different situation because of the way the Dutch were treated by the Germans when the occupying forces came in. There were one of the part headings in my novel is called The Velvet Glove, and that was the idea that the Germans initially treated the Dutch with this velvet glove approach. They saw them as their Germanic brothers. So initially, some of the things the occupation were, and maybe a softer set of consequences than you might expect or that you might have seen in other countries, especially if we compare it to something like Poland, where it was very swift, very harsh takeover. In the Netherlands, there was more of this idea of integrating the economy, gradually adopting Nazi ideology and policies, but they were rolled out one by one. And so I think if you think of that idea of a frog that's in a pot of water that's being heated gradually and it doesn't jump out, that's, I think, in some ways was coming into play. There were policies that were appalling, that were meant to segregate Jews from society and really stripping them of any sort of humane aspects of being contributing, valued members of society. But in the beginning, a lot of there's a lot also in Dutch society that I think helped enable the Germans to carry things out better. For example, this appreciation for bureaucracy and this a general idea of following the rules and doing your part. So I think the way that the German system was set up so efficiently, the Dutch played into it for a while without really understanding the consequences. And for example, in the beginning, the Jews were asked to register themselves. Most people did because you're told to do something. You're not sure yet of what the consequences are going to be. And by the time you do realize that, oh, it's a little bit too late, and the Germans have a very well documented system of understanding where everyone is living and whether they're Jewish or not. Likewise, when some of the deportations began happening, in the beginning, there were a lot of exceptions that the Germans were making, depending maybe on someone's occupation or whether they were fully Jewish or not. Gradually, a lot of those exceptions were revoked, but I think that gave people in the beginning some sort of false sense of security. If everything had happened on day one, there might have been more of a drastic reaction right away, because then it's very, very clear that something really serious is going to go really wrong.
So when did that tipping point take place, do you think? Later in the war?
I think the first major milestone was in February 1941, and we had in a couple of weeks a bunch of different things going on. The NSB, so the Dutch Fascist Party, had a few sort of violent clashes with Jewish people who were trying to take a bit of a stand. So there was this one incident at an ice cream salon where there was a bit of a sort of violent conflict. And then someone who was relatively high ranked, German, got killed in some of the skirmishes in these weeks. And that, of course, then leads to reprisals. And this first big reprisal was the first razzia, which is the term that was used for the roundup. And this was a very violent way. They essentially took 400 Jewish men, all of a sudden yanked them out of their homes, rounded them up in the square, throwing them to the ground, and boarded them onto these trucks that were the first deportations to the camps. So that led to the next couple of days. There was a widespread general strike in Amsterdam, but it also spread to other cities in the Netherlands. This was actually really unique for Western Europe. I think it was one of the only cases, if not the only case, of widespread general strike. So people all across the city went off work in protest over 2 days. But what ended up happening is the Germans then, first of all, they were taken by surprise because they hadn't expected that. But then secondly, they cracked down and ended up executing a lot of people who had been involved. So that was the first tipping point. And then I think the next one is in around May 1943, when we start seeing Dutch young men being rounded up for forced labor in Germany. I think that was the second really big catalyst that started encouraging people to be thinking more about resistance, and that really encouraged a lot more people to go into hiding.
Oh, interesting. Casey Sheffer, the man I talked about, was 20 at the time, and he himself went into hiding. They never registered him for a ration card. And he had a trap door under his bed and a secret passage where he hid from the Germans, much like the character in your book. Except the character in your book, sadly, didn't make it. And I believe that was based on your grandmother's brother, right?
Yes, exactly. That whole scene with the Germans raiding the house, down to the detail of them kicking the bucket of chicken feed as they came out. And yes, that's a bit of a spoiler. That was a story that my grandmother had told me that she remembered very distinctly. And of course, I've added in some character details on how Lisbeth processes that. But that for me, my grandmother grew up in the east of the Netherlands, so not in Amsterdam, not in a big city. She grew up in a small town, and she's spoken a lot about the difference between what life was like for people who were in a very big city versus what it was like for people in the smaller towns who did have access to things like a garden. And then you have a little more of this sense of some sort of security with the type of food that is coming in. So that's why you'll see in the book quite a lot of scenes that go back and forth between more the countryside and the city, and quite a lot about food and clothing, because that was something that for me was a really nice way of being able to work in some of these personal family stories.
Yes, and I expect that little towns all over the countryside wouldn't have had a huge German presence. I mean, they might have had a few soldiers stationed in some little tiny town to keep an eye on things, but most of the able-bodied men were needed on the front lines.
Yeah, I think there were always some sort of presence. There's another detail in the novel, in one of the country scenes, about these German soldiers that were homesick and that were crying at night in the schoolhouse in the small town that they were posted at. That's another detail that I took from someone I know whose grandfather told me that story. So I think there was in a lot of towns some sort of presence, but of course that varied so much depending on the size and the strategic location of the town.
Yeah, that was a very poignant story, and actually one that my own father told me after he joined the Royal Canadian Air Force and went off for training. He said you could hear after lights out, you could hear boys sobbing in their bunks with homesickness and fright over what was in store for them. So I can imagine it must have been that much worse in an occupied country.
Yeah, and I think that's really important to remember, and something that in all of my writing that I want to focus on, whether it's World War II or another, I think, some sort of conflict, is the idea that we are all human, regardless of which side of the war we are on. And there were people who did bad things, and there were people who did good things. And everyone on all sides, I think, was homesick or missing a loved one. And I think that's really important for me also in The Dutch Wife, that I really like looking at this idea, the psychology of both victims and perpetrators, and remembering at the end of the day that I think everyone just wanted the war to be over.
Good point. Now, one of the things that struck me about your book, The Dutch Orphan, was the motherhood issue. I think that so many women, mothers in particular, would not have dared to resist the occupation because their whole being was focused on getting their kids safe through this thing. And the idea that the Jewish mothers had a choice of surrendering their kids to a complete stranger and getting on that train by themselves and leaving their child behind, or believing that they were better off, the child would be better off to stay with her, the mother, and take the child with you. And then arriving at the camp, realizing what was really going on and understanding that you had made the wrong choice, that now both you and your child were going to be executed. That must have been horrendous. I know that the Sheffer family took this Jewish couple in for the 2-year 43 and 40, well, 43 until the war ended. And they had 2 little girls, and 2 farm families each took one of the little girls and hid them for the duration of the war. So they didn't see their own kids for 2 years, and they didn't know where they were. They were never told. They were just told that they were safe, but not where they were hiding. And of course, they were reunited after the war ended. In fact, after that very moving scene in your book where the Allies come in and liberate the country, this Jewish couple remained in hiding for 3 or 4 days because they were too scared to come out. They couldn't believe that that the Germans wouldn't come back again. But anyway, the idea of the separation of mothers and children during the war, and the terrible risk that Joe took in adopting the Jewish baby, that was very powerful for me as a mother and grandmother.
And thank you. That was a scene that I definitely had to rewrite a few times. I don't have children, but a friend of mine who the character of Johanna was very closely inspired by, she was pregnant and ended up giving birth around the time that I was writing these scenes. So I really sat down with her and said, okay, I need you to talk me through this, you know, can you take a look at this? What do you feel is missing? And that was really helpful for me. Also really, I think, quite interesting. You touched on the idea of these Jewish mothers who maybe gave up their children with the hopes that they would be safe or left behind. That's something that was happening often around the stage that people were being rounded up for deportations. and they were brought to a theater in Amsterdam, this Jewish theater that was converted into a holding center. And there were often cases, the young children, were brought across the street to a sort of daycare center where there were some Jewish nurses who would look after them. And these nurses were really involved in rescuing children. But often it was quite a difficult decision because sometimes the parents, not knowing necessarily what situation they were headed towards, thought, no, it's better if the children stay with me. And I have such deep admiration for those who did have the foresight and the bravery to be able to say, I think it's better that you take my child, and try to get them into a hiding place somewhere. I spoke to someone recently who was one of those babies that was adopted by a Christian family during the war and passed off as Christian. And one of the things that she told me that was really fascinating was the idea that there was also so much that happened after the war, once these families were reunited, with children that maybe they had gone 3 or 4 years without seeing, who had never actually really known their birth mothers, and how on a trauma level, how many issues that created in terms of trying to reunite these families, and then having to cut the ties with these mothers who had adopted them and nurtured them for several years, and really not known whether the parents would come back ever, and maybe thought that this was now their child that they were taking in for the rest of their lives.
Terrible situation. Yeah, I just wanted to mention another interesting thing that came up in the book, which was the use of drugs. I didn't realize, is it called Pervitin? That's how you pronounce it. Which was a stimulant, and Elizabeth's husband is a pharmacist, and he's doling out drugs to the German officers, and starts taking it himself. Could you tell me a little more about that drug use and how that came about? Was it very common?
Yeah, actually, in case you're wondering where I got that information, it was this book. I have it right here. It's called Blitz. It's a German historian that wrote it. So essentially, Pervitin came in pill format. It was a low-dose methamphetamine. You can think a little bit like crystal meth. That sounds really heavy and intense. It was an intense drug, but in a low-dose form. And for a while, all types of people were taking it: housewives, people in office jobs, people in the military. It was sort of seen as a bit of almost a cure-all in terms of, are you having trouble sleeping? Are you losing interest in sex? Take this pill and it will do wonders. So this was something that we're seeing in the late 1930s in Germany. And I think really interesting because on the one hand, we have Hitler and the Nazi Party wanting to present a very clean image. They were against drug and alcohol use. On the other hand, the way that the different regulations were working at this time were actually enabling Pervitin to be sold widespread in pharmacies, with a relatively, I think, loose prescription model as well. And Hitler ended up being hooked on quite a cocktail of drugs himself, which were prescribed by his personal physician. So there's lots of interesting stories about it. I think one of the most interesting ones is just how much it might have played a role in the initial advance of the Germans into France and into Poland. And there's a quote in the book that says, in less than 100 hours, the Germans gained more territory than they had in over 4 years during the First World War. And the theory is that a lot of these men, especially in the tank battalions, were on this sort of trial run of Pervitin, which meant that they didn't have the same requirements for sleep and rest that the Allies did. So they could keep going through the night. And essentially, Churchill was baffled and thinking, what is going on? Why does this army not seem to need any rest? So that was something that my editor and I had been talking about with my earlier novel, and I thought, oh, this is really interesting, and I think I can work it into this book. So there were just so many details from that research that I thought, again, something that I'd never heard about, something that there is a bit of research out there, but not that many books about it. But I think it does add a really interesting twist to some of our knowledge about the Germans and maybe how and why these soldiers were behaving the way they did in combat. And of course, it's no secret that all sorts of armies, the American army as well, has done all sorts of trials with drug experiments in the soldiers. But I think this is something that doesn't get talked about that much in World War II history.
No, I've read fleeting references to the bomber crews in the Royal Air Force being given their wakey pill as they were getting on the plane, because they had, basically 12 hours of flying, 6 hours over there and 6 hours back. It was a long time to stay awake and to stay alert. And I'm guessing it must probably have been the same class of drugs, but I've heard or read very little about drug use in the Allied forces. Interesting. Now, the end of the book, the happy ending, of course, we all know that the war ended happily for our side. I was so touched by your description of the people in Amsterdam learning that the Allies were on their way and that they were in the final days of occupation, and seeing the Germans start loading up their possessions and heading out of the city in jeeps and hightailing it out of there. And then hearing they're coming, and people got dressed up and they put orange ribbons in their hair and they went out and stood on the street waiting for the first Allies to arrive. That was, I get choked up just thinking about it right now. That was a very powerful scene and must have been a fantastic day for the people.
I think there's what makes that so complicated as well is that this sense of anticipation. First of all, the south of the Netherlands had been liberated quite a while earlier. But there was something, and it's also a scene that takes place in the novel, this idea of, it's known as Mad Tuesday. That was in the September prior to the liberation. There was this false victory, miscommunication over the radio, and people across the country thought that the country had been liberated. So you had everyone go out, put on their orange, start celebrating in the streets, parades, that kind of thing. Germans, the NSB members were all on the run. And it turned out that it was all just a miscommunication. So there was this huge sense of disappointment and fear. So what you were saying earlier about the Jewish couple in hiding who didn't dare leave the hiding place for several days, that makes total sense, especially in the context of knowing that there was a false alarm earlier. And I think just that sense of what could still happen, what could change. And also even the day in Amsterdam, this was a scene that got deleted out of the novel, but it was actually one of the scenes that I was most intrigued about in the research process. Was the day before the troops arrived in Amsterdam, there were a whole bunch of people. They had already arrived in other cities nearby in Utrecht and the surrounding cities. So a whole bunch of people went into Dam Square, the central square in Amsterdam, and there was this big gathering and people were in a very celebratory mood. There was organ grinders and people dancing in the streets, that kind of thing. And then there was this incident, and it's still unclear exactly what happened. But there were some German Marine soldiers that were up on a balcony. You can still see the same balcony if you're in Amsterdam in the main square. And they were overlooking the crowd and something happened. They got provoked in some way. There was speculation was, I don't know, someone hitting on one of the guy's girlfriends or something. Something happened, provoked these soldiers, and they ended up opening fire on the crowd of onlookers. And quite a few people died, lots and lots of injuries. But that was this absolutely horrifying thing at the cusp of liberation. And people essentially were acting like we are free. And then you have this big scare. So then the next day, when the Canadians actually did come into the city, you can imagine how much trepidation there must have been, and this worry about, is it for real this time? Do we dare to celebrate? And what are the consequences if we are celebrating too openly?
Now, you said the Canadians arrived first, and I know that Canadians have always had a special place in the Dutch hearts for being the liberators, I guess, and it took them many, many weeks of hard fighting to get to where they were. Is that still a thing today in the Netherlands? Do you experience anybody saying, oh, you're Canadian? Good for you.
I mean, there's absolutely still a link today. I think there are warm feelings between both countries. We still see the Tulip Festival in Ottawa every year. Those tulips are a gift from the Dutch government in thanks for the liberation. There are a lot of connections. I think if you look at my own family history, my grandparents, both of my mother's parents, ended up immigrating from the Netherlands to Canada. And I'm sure that choice in going to Canada over another country was in part influenced by the sentiment that followed the liberation. I think there's continued to be really good trade relations between the two countries. Someone I know who's in the Canadian military wrote me a few weeks ago, someone I went to high school with in St. Albert actually, and wrote to me and said, I'm in Amsterdam. I was just in Wageningen, where the liberation documents were officially signed, the capitulation documents. And he said, I was just there with the military and I was so moved. I was so emotional by the reception that we got. It was really touching. And the fact that there's still, children holding these Canadian paper Canadian flags, and there's Canadian flags all out on the streets, and we were just treated with such respect and admiration. So I think even though, of course, generations are changing, there is still in the Netherlands a lot of focus on the liberation and remembrance, and Canada will continue to play a big part in that.
That's wonderful. Ellen, you're a very easy person to interview. So I'm just going to give you one last question. I'm sure people are interested to know what your future holds. Do you have a day job, or have you been able to successfully make writing a full-time career?
At the moment, I'm mostly writing, but I also teach writing classes online. So I teach 1 or 2 evenings a week, and then the days leading up to it, I'm prepping for those classes. But over the summer, for example, I'm going to be focused fully on writing, and I'm starting another book, not World War II focused, but hopefully set in New York in the 1950s in the backdrop of the Cuban Revolution. So we'll see. That's the book that I was working on a few years ago, and now I'm hopefully returning to it, and I'm curious to see how that's going to come together.
Oh yeah, interesting, because publishers generally like you to stay in your genre if you're successful with one, or in your case 2 books. So are they fine about you moving to a different country at a different time?
We'll see. I have not had that conversation yet. That's probably something that we'll be discussing in the next couple of months. But in the meantime, that's what I'm working on. That's what I'm hoping to move forward with, and we'll see how that goes. Of course, there is an abundance, perhaps an oversaturation of World War II books on the market. But there continues to be a lot of interest in them for one reason or the other. So
yes, it is interesting. Just recently, there's just been a flood of Second World War fiction, and I'm wondering if that wave is going to pass, or what exactly is sparked. I think it's being sparked by the fact that our veterans, the last few veterans, are now passing away, and people want to hear their stories before it's too late. I'm just going to check over here on the chat and see if there are any questions for you. Her first book was wonderful. waiting for the next book, looking forward to it. I appreciate the fact that you included the drug use. This one says, "Hi, Ellen. I love The Dutch Wife and the courage it took to tell that very important story. I'd love to hear how much time you spent during research and writing. Can you talk more about the process?"
Yes, actually, I was very curious myself, this book, because I'm a very notoriously slow writer. Often I will have writing sessions with other writing friends, and they will produce in an hour 4 times the amount of words that I do. So I was very curious. I decided to time myself and figure out how long it takes me to write a novel. So I broke it down, and I realized in the end, I spent 10% of the time on research. But of course, I had quite a basis already from the first novel, and also a degree focusing on World War II history. So I think had that not been the case, the research element would have been much higher. 40% of the time writing the first draft, and 50% of the time was revision. So moving forward in the editorial process. I think a lot of people have this idea of getting a draft out and then you're mainly fixing the language and the grammar and that kind of thing. But so much of the writing process is really critically rethinking and restructuring. And in this case, I had 2 sisters. Originally, I had written the draft with 2 different voices, both in the third person. And we ended up moving Johanna's voice into first person. So using I, just to get a little more focus on her story and try to bring her to life a little bit more. So those kind of changes, I think, end up taking a lot of the time and energy focus. In terms of the research, I was in a bit of a tricky position because this book was written entirely during COVID. So I didn't get to do quite as much as I would have liked to in terms of things like interviews, that sort of thing. So some of those happened actually after the book was edited. What I did do as much as possible when lockdown was over was go to the war archives. Amsterdam has a wonderful reading room with old newspaper clippings, countless diaries. There's been a really big movement in the Netherlands to get people to submit family diaries and other mementos or things from the war. So a lot of these diaries have been digitized, and you can access some of them even online. And I think so I spent quite a bit of time in the archives, quite a bit of time just gathering information from friends and family. I think if anyone I speak to here has a grandfather or a cousin or an uncle or someone who was in some way either in the resistance or have some interesting story about the war. So I felt like I was just collecting from here and there and pulling things together until I had a lot to work with. I think there's almost no scene in the novel that wasn't in some way inspired by a story that someone told me or something I read somewhere. There's very little that I actually made up entirely. So it was a lot of just trying to stitch everything together. One of the things that I found really interesting in the research process was this whole idea of the bounty hunters that comes into the novel. And that's this idea that there was a branch of civil servants that was set up, and also at the same time part of the police force. And it was tasked with the idea of essentially betraying Jews in hiding. So these group of men would go around. A lot of them were, say, taxi drivers, or maybe had somewhat of a criminal or shady background in previous jobs. And they would go and they would essentially try to pry information out of people, or see, if they could bribe people, try to have whatever they could to get this bounty on the Jews that were arrested. And they were paid 7 guilders per person that was arrested. And there was quite a lot of corruption in this as well. A lot of money, bribes that they would accept from the Jews, say in the form of jewels or something, promising them safety, and then they would turn around and still arrest them. So there were some really horrific stories, but all the police reports that they filed were in the archives. So that was something that I think one of the most moving experiences in the research was really reading report by report what happened to certain individuals and the stories they were trying to tell to try to convince these men not to arrest them or to help them in some way. And that was really, really tragic to read, but also it made it feel very personal, I think, when you break it down onto an individual level, rather than just reading something in form of statistics or broader stories.
Yes, I think that's the beauty of writing about the Second World War, or in your future book, the 50s. There are still people around who remember and can tell you things and teach you things. Whereas if you're writing about ancient Rome, that's, you have to rely strictly on old documents. Here's another question from Corey. What aspects do you rewrite or edit the most? The relationship between the characters or describing the environment to create a sense of place, etc.?
For me, I think I tend to want to overload the setting and the research details in the beginning. I think because I come across so many interesting tidbits that in my first drafts, there was a lot more war context, a lot more description of different battles that were maybe taking place to provide broader background information. We stripped a lot of that out in the editing process, but where I really think I spent the most time and where I need the most work is getting into the heads of these characters, and especially the relationship between the sisters. It was really important to me to show this contrast between them, but also I struggled to find the balance in the beginning of when are the sisters close and what is pulling them apart, and how do you still maintain that sisterly bond when politically and ideologically your values are pulling you in two very different directions. So I spent a lot of time trying to work on the emotional nuance of that, and a lot of work goes into trying to find some harmony in the timeline. It's really tricky when you're writing two different characters that are braided together, because anytime a chapter ends, you need the other sister's chapter needs to start in the future. So that creates a lot of complications when I want to show things that maybe are happening a couple of days apart, and how to coordinate that with the broader timeline of historically what was happening during the war.
This isn't a question, but it's a comment, I presume directed at you. Hi, hun, the hammock is ready for you. Mom and Dad, Auntie Sue, Marg, and Khaleesi.
Yeah, Khaleesi is the dog.
Oh, there are so many horrifying aspects of war. I think there's just one more question here. How do you decide where you're going to draw the line in your storytelling? I presume so that it isn't too horrific to read.
That's a really good question. I think you'll see different answers depending on if you're looking at my first novel or the second novel. With The Dutch Wife, it was by nature very grim subject matter. And I really told myself I was not going to shy away from the truth of what happened and what these people went through. So with The Dutch Wife, there's also a storyline that takes place in Argentina in the 1970s about a student who's imprisoned for trying to take a stand against the dictatorship there. And all of those scenes of what happens to him, the actual plot points of what's happening to him and the torture that he's experiencing comes from witness testimonies in the court cases after the fact. And there are some really gruesome details in there, and I know that it's not palatable for all readers, but for me, I really stand by the fact that I think we need to not sugarcoat history. I think if you're picking up a World War II book or a book of this nature, you need to be able to confront yourself with what people went through. And I think it would be just doing a dishonor to some of the victims of the war if we brush over some of these details. The second novel is, I think, it's quite different in terms of the subject matter. It doesn't go as dark. There was a scene, trying not to have spoilers, but there's a scene at one point in a camp, and it takes place in a small bunker cell, and that is quite a very heavy, dark scene. And that was one scene that was coming straight from something that I saw in the museum of the camp itself. The camp still exists. And I really took, again, the witness testimonies of what happened there and worked them very closely into the story. And that was definitely the hardest scene to write. But for me, it also feels like a very important one, because I think it is important to show all these different things that happened and not feel like we're just trying to cut out and pick and choose for what makes an entertaining story or something that makes us feel good when we're reading it.
Any chance of a movie in the works?
I'm not too sure. There are some maybe discussions on the table, but very, 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 very beginning stages of something.
Well, I think we can all agree that both of those books would make fantastic movies, but I understand it's a long shot. To get a book made into a movie these days takes a lot of time and money and effort. Yeah, I've there are some lovely comments here. Congratulations. Hello, Ellen, on behalf of BCHS. Congratulations on your success as a writer. Always heartwarming to see the paths our students have taken after leaving our halls. Love The Dutch Wife. Looking forward to reading The Dutch Orphan. Well done, Ms. Jones.
Thanks. That's so sweet. It's really nice. I'm so grateful for everyone who took time out of their weekend today to be here. It means a lot.
Well, and I'm popping on to say thank you to both of you. Like I said, this was kind of amazing because we've got 3 different time zones going on here. Ellen, I don't know if you're a night owl or not, but it's getting probably decently late for you.
On me.
So thank you to you both. Thank you to everybody for popping on this afternoon. We are announcing our fall STARFest Festival lineup tomorrow. So if you pop onto the STARFest website, maybe give us a couple hours. So by 10 o'clock in the morning, we should have the fall lineup up there. I'm very excited about it. I'm very excited that we were able to do this. And I'm going to say good afternoon and good night. And thanks. So we'll keep an eye on both of you for the next books. So
thank you so much.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. Good night and good afternoon.